All right, ready to dive into some Freud.
Let's do it.
Today we're tackling Freud's group psychology.
Oh, this is a good one.
It can be a little dense, I'll admit.
Yeah.
But stick with us. We're going to pull out some seriously insightful stuff about how groups, how they actually work.
I think what's so fascinating about Freud is, he really hit on how our individual psychology,
Right?
like all of our thoughts and feelings and everything, all that internal stuff can totally shift when we're suddenly a part of a group.
Yeah, it's like our brains kind of go through this temporary transformation when we're in a group setting, and it's
Right.
like thinking about it, we spend so much of our lives in groups.
Oh, totally.
I mean, work, online communities, even just like hanging out with friends,
Yeah.
understanding this stuff is it can be a game changer.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And, one of the most impactful ideas I think that Freud put forward is this concept of regression. Basically, he believed that groups, being in groups, can actually trigger this sort of psychological time machine.
Oh.
Taking us back to a more primal, a more instinctual state of being.
Okay, so less thinking brain and more like feeling brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, think about it this way. When you're in a big group of people, right, that part of your mind that's usually in charge of like self-control
Yeah.
and rational decision-making, what Freud called, the ego,
Yeah.
that gets a little, it gets a little relaxed.
It takes a break.
It takes a break. We become way more susceptible to the overall energy of the group, whether that's excitement or fear, even anger.
So that explains that whole mob mentality kind of thing,
Yeah.
where it's like our sense of individual responsibility just gets kind of like diluted
Yeah,
in the crowd.
exactly. And this ties into another key concept, which is heightened suggestibility.
Okay.
Freud was influenced by Gustave Le Bon,
Oh, yeah.
who had this idea that crowds, they can develop a kind of collective mind that can actually override our individual reasoning.
So it's not even just being influenced by the group. It's almost like our minds get temporarily absorbed into this larger collective consciousness.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Whoa.
And this is what makes us so much more vulnerable to suggestions from, leaders or even just the prevailing mood of the group.
Right. Which makes me think about how important it is to be aware who we're choosing to follow,
Oh, absolutely.
both, online
Yeah.
and in real life. Because, according to Freud, these leaders, they often take on a very specific role in our unconscious minds.
That's right. Freud believed that leaders can become almost like parental figures.
Mm. Okay, not our actual parents.
Definitely not.
Hopefully not. But there's something about that dynamic that taps into that deep primal need
Yeah.
for authority and guidance.
For sure. For sure. It's that human need to feel protected and directed, especially when we're feeling uncertain or threatened by something.
Right, and that's where libidinal ties come in.
Yes.
I know that sounds a little
A little complicated.
complicated, yeah.
Can be. But, think of it this way. It's not just about romantic love,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's about any kind of deep emotional bond
Okay.
that ties people together.
So that feeling when you're part of a team and you're yes, we're all clicking, we all have this shared purpose.
Exactly.
That camaraderie, is that what kind of Freud's talking about?
Exactly. Those libidinal ties, they create this incredible sense of unity, right?
Right.
And belonging within the group. And they can even motivate people to put the group's needs above their own individual needs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's powerful. So it's almost like our individual egos, our sense of self kind of gets temporarily merged with the collective.
Yeah. Freud called this the merging of the ego with the collective. He observed that in groups, individuals become aligned with the group's goals and values, that their own personal desires kind of fade into the background.
So it's not even just that we're influenced by the group. It's part of our sense of self actually gets absorbed into the group identity.
Precisely. And that can have both, positive
Yeah.
and negative consequences.
That's, I guess, where we start to get into the the darker side of
Yeah.
this group psychology stuff.
Right. This merging of the ego with the group. It can also explain why people sometimes act in ways they never would on their own.
Right.
Both acts of incredible selflessness and, unfortunately, acts of aggression or cruelty.
That's a little unsettling to think about. Could any of us get swept up in that kind of group dynamic?
That's a question we should all ask ourselves because, Freud, he identified some serious risks
Right.
that come with being part of a group. One of the biggest ones is the potential for a loss of individuality.
Like we become more focused on like fitting in
Yes,
than like thinking for ourselves.
exactly. We become so aligned with the group's norms and values that we can lose our, like, critical thinking skills and our ability to make,
Yeah.
independent judgments.
Right, and that can be dangerous because then it leads to that whole like groupthink thing
Oh, yeah.
where everyone starts like thinking and acting alike and anyone who disagrees just gets like totally silenced.
Right. That's a really important point. And when that happens, when groupthink takes over, groups can make really, really terrible decisions
Mm.
because they're not, thinking about all the angles. They're not considering all the potential consequences.
Right, so how do we protect ourselves from falling into that trap?
Well, I think the first step is, awareness.
Mm.
Just recognizing that this tendency exists in all groups. That's crucial.
Mm-hmm.
And then we need to actively cultivate, I think, a culture of open discussion and debate where people feel safe to actually challenge the status quo
Right.
and express, opinions that might be different, dissenting opinions.
That sounds like a good like leadership challenge. How do you create that kind of environment, especially in like a large group?
It's definitely not easy, but there are some things I think that leaders can do. First, they need to model that behavior themselves.
Okay.
They need to show that they are open to hearing different perspectives,
Right.
and that they actually value critical thinking.
So it's not about being like the all-knowing leader, but it's about being the leader who's willing to like learn and be challenged.
Exactly. That's it. And, leaders also need to create, I think, clear structures for feedback and dissent.
Oh, interesting.
Make it easy for people to actually voice their concerns.
Right.
And then make sure that those concerns are heard and addressed.
So having a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up, even if it's like disagreeing with the leader
Yes, yes.
or, the majority.
Exactly. It's about creating that culture of psychological safety
Right.
where people actually feel like, my opinions are valued,
Right.
they're respected, even if they're not the popular opinion.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about the loss of individuality and the dangers of groupthink. What are some of the other like risks that Freud, identified?
Well, another big one is the emotional volatility of groups. Emotions can spread like wildfire in a group setting,
Mm-hmm.
and that can lead to, unpredictable and sometimes dangerous behavior.
I think we've all seen examples of that in the news where, a crowd gets like whipped up into a frenzy
Oh, yeah.
and then things just spiral out of control.
Right. And again, this ties back to that idea that groups can trigger this regression to a more primal, emotional state.
So we're less able to like think rationally and control our impulses when we're like in the midst of that kind of like emotional storm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can lead to, some pretty scary outcomes.
Which brings us to perhaps like the most chilling aspect of, Freud's group psychology, this idea that groups can actually like lower our ethical standards.
It's a disturbing thought, isn't it? But, Freud observed that being part of a group, it can create this kind of like shared morality, right?
Yeah.
That might deviate significantly from what individuals would consider ethical on their own.
So the group's like norms and values become almost like a shield,
Yeah.
protecting individuals from like feeling the full weight of their actions.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And it can have, disastrous consequences. We see this throughout history, in cases of mob violence, political extremism, even genocide.
Right. It's a stark reminder that even good people can do terrible things when they're caught up in the wrong kind of group dynamic.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to be aware of these tendencies and to, develop strategies for resisting them.
So how do we do that? How do we like navigate these group dynamics in a way that's like both healthy and ethical?
That is the million-dollar question. And, unfortunately, there's no easy answer. But I think one of the most important things is to cultivate a strong sense of personal responsibility.
So even when we're part of a group, we need to remember that we're still like individuals who are accountable for our own choices.
Absolutely, yes. We need to be willing to, question the group's norms
Mm.
and to speak up when we see something that, doesn't feel right.
So becoming more aware of these dynamics is really just like the first step.
It is.
The real work is in learning how to use that knowledge to like make more conscious and ethical decisions, in our own lives.
That's exactly right. It's about, taking ownership of our role and the groups that we belong to and working to create a more positive and a more ethical group experience for everyone involved.
I think that's a great place to pause for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into Freud's group psychology. When we come back, we'll explore some more practical applications of these ideas and talk about how you can use this knowledge to, navigate your own group experiences more effectively. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into Freud's group psychology. We covered some pretty heavy stuff,
Yeah.
Loss of individuality,
Right.
dangers of groupthink even, like the idea that groups can lower our ethical standards. But now I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and talk about how we can actually use this knowledge to make our lives better.
I love that. That's a great point. Understanding these dynamics isn't just about recognizing the risks.
Right.
It's also about, harnessing the incredible power of groups for good, for positive change.
So instead of getting swept away by the current, we can learn to navigate it more skillfully.
Exactly. Yeah, think about all the amazing things that have been accomplished through collective action.
Right.
Social movements, scientific breakthroughs, artistic collaborations.
Yeah.
Groups can be an incredible force for good when they're functioning effectively.
Absolutely. But how do we make sure that our groups are functioning effectively?
Right.
I mean, it's not like we can just snap our fingers and erase all those unconscious dynamics Freud was talking about.
Of course not. But I think the first step, again, is awareness.
Yeah.
Once you understand these dynamics, you start seeing them everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
In your workplace, in your online communities, even in your family.
Right. And that awareness can be so empowering because
Yeah.
it allows you to make more conscious choices about how you want to participate
Exactly.
in those groups.
Right. Instead of just going with the flow,
Mm.
you can start to ask yourself, what role am I playing
Yeah.
in this group?
Right.
Am I contributing to a culture of critical thinking, or am I just reinforcing the status quo?
Wow.
Am I being a good follower, or am I just, blindly obeying authority?
That's a powerful set of questions to ask yourself. It's like you're taking a step back from the group and looking at it through this more objective lens.
Exactly. And that's how you start to become a more discerning and responsible group member.
So, let's get into some specifics. How can we apply these ideas to different areas of our lives? I know a lot of our listeners are probably thinking about how this applies to, the workplace.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Workplaces are, essentially giant petri dishes of group dynamics.
Oh, yeah.
You've got teams, you've got departments, you've got company culture.
It's all happening at once.
It's all happening at once, right? And understanding these dynamics can be a real asset in navigating that environment.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, knowing about this stuff could actually help someone climb the corporate ladder or at least not get totally trampled
Well,
in the process.
I wouldn't promise, a guaranteed promotion,
Right.
but it can certainly give you a leg up. Think about it this way. If you understand how groupthink works, right,
Yeah.
you can be more proactive in, speaking up with dissenting ideas, challenging the status quo.
Okay, so less yes man and more thoughtful contributor.
Exactly. Yes. And on the flip side, if you're in a leadership position,
Right.
understanding Freud's work can help you build more cohesive, more productive teams.
Okay.
You can be more aware of how your own actions and communication, might be perceived. Are you accidentally tapping into those unconscious, parental figure vibes?
Now I'm picturing some of my old bosses.
Right. But the point is, by being more conscious of these dynamics, right,
Yeah.
you can create a more positive and collaborative environment where people actually feel safe to share their ideas and contribute their best work.
So it's not about manipulating people or exploiting these group tendencies for personal gain. It's about using this knowledge to create healthier
Yeah.
and more effective group interactions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about workplaces. These dynamics play out in our personal lives, too.
Right.
Think about your family, your friend groups,
Yeah.
even the online communities you're part of.
Ooh, social media is probably a whole other beast, right?
Oh, absolutely. Social media has amplified so many of the psychological phenomena that Freud described.
Yeah.
The formation of echo chambers,
Yeah.
the spread of misinformation, the intensity of online mobs.
It's social media has taken those primal group instincts and
Yeah.
put them on hyperdrive.
Yeah, in many ways, yes. which makes it even more crucial to be aware of these dynamics and
Yeah.
to, develop strategies for navigating them in, healthy and productive ways.
So it's not about like avoiding social media altogether. It's about becoming a more like conscious and discerning participant.
That's right. Ask yourself, you know, what kind of online communities do I want to be a part of?
Right.
Am I contributing to a culture of, respect and understanding, or am I just adding to the noise?
Right.
Am I being critical of the information that I'm consuming, or am I just accepting everything at face value?
It's about like taking responsibility for like the energy we're putting out into the world, even
Yes,
in those like seemingly like anonymous online spaces.
absolutely. And it's also about recognizing that even in the digital realm, we're still dealing with real human beings,
Right.
with real emotions, with real vulnerabilities.
So even though we might not be like face to face, those same rules of like ethical engagement still apply.
Exactly. And remember, even in those online spaces, we have the power to choose who we follow,
Right.
what content we engage with, and what kind of conversations we want to participate in.
So it's not about being like a passive consumer of social media.
No.
It's about being like an active curator
Yeah.
of our own like online
I
experience.
love that. An active curator, that's a great way to think about it.
All right, so we talked about workplaces and social media. Are there any other areas where like this knowledge can be like particularly helpful?
Well, I think it's particularly relevant to understanding political dynamics.
Oh, interesting.
After all, politics is all about groups,
Mhm.
parties, movements, ideologies.
And like looking back at history, we can see how easily those groups can like fall prey to, the very dynamics that Freud was warning about.
Absolutely. Think about, propaganda, political rallies, the rise of charismatic leaders.
Yeah.
It's all playing on those deep-seated psychological tendencies we've been talking about.
So it's not just about like disagreeing with someone's political views. It's about recognizing that like those views are often shaped by
Yes.
these like powerful unconscious forces.
That's a really nuanced point, and it's something that's so often missing, I think, from our political discourse these days.
Hmm.
Instead of just like demonizing the other side,
Right.
we need to develop a deeper understanding of the psychological forces that are driving those divisions.
That's a tough challenge in, today's political climate.
It
But
is.
I think it's like incredibly important work.
I agree. And it starts with each of us, developing a more sophisticated understanding of our own political psychology.
Hmm.
Why do we believe what we believe? Who are we choosing to follow and why?
Right.
What are the underlying emotional needs
Right.
that are driving our political choices?
It's about bringing a level of like self-awareness and like critical thinking to our like political engagement rather than just like reacting emotionally
Yes.
to like slogans and sound bites.
Exactly. And that's how we start to, break down those echo chambers
Right.
and build a more constructive and productive political dialogue.
So it's not about like erasing our like political differences. It's about finding a way to like engage with those differences in a more like thoughtful and compassionate way.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. And I think that's, ultimately what Freud's work invites us to do is to become more conscious
Right.
and more intentional participants
Right.
in all of the groups that shape our lives.
So it's not about being like a passive passenger. It's about becoming like an active co-creator
Yes.
of the group experience.
Well said. That's a pretty empowering thought, wouldn't you say?
It is. It reminds us that we all have a role to play in like shaping the future of, our groups, our communities, ultimately like our society as a whole.
Absolutely.
And that's perhaps like the most hopeful takeaway from our deep dive into Freud's work.
It is.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the risks of group psychology, but we've also talked about like the incredible potential of groups to, achieve amazing things.
Yes.
And we've explored how this knowledge can be applied to like, our workplaces, our online lives, and even our like political engagement.
Yeah.
And I think the key takeaway here is that like understanding these dynamics isn't just about like intellectual knowledge. It's about like developing a deeper awareness of like ourselves and our role in the world.
Right. Becoming more conscious and intentional in how we navigate this complex social landscape that we're all a part of.
Right. And that's a journey that takes like ongoing effort and
Yeah.
like self-reflection.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's a journey that's like well worth taking
For sure.
because it can lead to like a more fulfilling, more meaningful, and ultimately like a more connected life.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, I think that's a great place to wrap up part two
Okay.
of our deep dive into Freud's group psychology. When we come back, we'll share some final thoughts
Okay.
and leave you with some key takeaways to ponder as you continue your own exploration of this fascinating topic. All right, welcome back for the final part of our deep dive. I feel like we've been like spelunking in Freud's brain.
It has been quite a journey.
It has. So now that we've, crawled through all those psychological tunnels,
Right.
I'd love to hear like your biggest takeaways from our whole conversation about Freud's group psychology.
You know, I think for me, the most crucial insight is that, we're not simply just individuals who are like thrown into groups, right?
Right.
Like our psychology actually, it fundamentally intertwines
Right.
with the groups that we're a part of.
Right.
And I think, understanding this, it can help us avoid those common traps. Like we talked about groupthink.
Yeah.
Make more conscious choices
Yeah.
about the groups that we join and how we participate in them.
Yeah, totally. And it's not just about like avoiding the negative, right? Like recognizing the power of those libidinal ties, that feeling of like belonging
Yes.
and shared purpose, that can be incredibly motivating. I mean, think about a time when you were part of a team and you were just like clicking.
Well, yeah,
Like you just felt that like camaraderie.
it's magic.
It is. It can fuel some amazing achievements.
It really can. And, even when we do encounter that darker side of groups, right?
Yeah.
Like understanding these dynamics can help us navigate those challenges more effectively. Like imagine you're in a meeting and, groupthink starts to take over.
Oh, yeah.
Right. If you're aware of that tendency, you can gently push back. You can encourage different opinions, help the group, make a more informed decision.
It's like having this like secret decoder ring for
Mhm.
understanding these like hidden forces at play.
Yeah, exactly. And,
Yeah.
it's not about becoming like cynical
Right.
or distrustful of groups. It's about approaching them with a more nuanced understanding, recognizing both their potential for good and the challenges that come with those collective dynamics.
Totally. And it's important to remember that like Freud's work, this was like the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
There's been so much research in social psychology
Right.
since then
Absolutely.
that builds on this stuff.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like fields like, social neuroscience, behavioral economics, like they're adding like even more layers to our understanding of like how groups influence us.
For sure.
So it's this like constantly evolving field of knowledge.
Always more to learn.
Always more to learn. But I do think that like Freud's work, it remains like incredibly relevant. Like it's like a foundational framework for understanding these like complexities of group behavior.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought.
Okay.
Think about the groups that you are a part of.
Yeah.
Your work team, your family, your online communities.
Right.
Do you see any of these dynamics that we've talked about like playing out in those groups?
That's a great question. And even more importantly, how can you use this new awareness, all this stuff we talked about,
Right.
to become a more positive, more influential
Right.
and ethical member of those groups?
Because ultimately, like, I believe that understanding group psychology, this isn't just about like acquiring knowledge.
Yeah.
It is about like using that knowledge
Yes.
to create like a more conscious, more compassionate and
Yeah.
like connected world.
I couldn't agree more. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, right?
Yeah.
And that the choices that we make within our groups, they have this ripple effect, and it extends, far beyond ourselves.
Yeah. So as you go about your day-to-day, pay attention to those group dynamics around you. Like ask yourself, what kind of group member do I want to be?
Right.
Am I contributing to a culture of trust and respect?
Mm-hmm.
Am I using my influence for good?
Powerful questions.
Yeah.
And remember, even small changes in our individual behavior can have a big impact on the groups that we're a part of.
Totally. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Freud's group psychology.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you found it insightful and empowering. And to all our listeners, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep striving to make your groups the best they can be. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations flowing.